October 8, 2019. Joseph Elledge, aka Joe, went to bed with his wife, Mengqi Ji, around 11 p.m. or 11:30 p.m. But when he woke up the next morning, Mengqi Ji was not there. Only her phone and wedding ring were there on a table. Mengqi Ji was a young mom with the 1-year-old child. Professionally, she was as a reputed engineer. Everything was just going great. They appeared to be the perfect family on social media. But behind the scenes, their relationship had been tough with lots of heated arguments. Later, it was discovered that Mengqi Ji had been communicating with someone else online. They were even sending each other explicit messages and photos, and it seemed like she was emotionally involved with that guy who might have been in China. The authorities investigated if Mengqi Ji had planned to meet this person or maybe even travel to China. But no clear signs came up, like flight bookings or rideshare activity. Rather, investigators discovered 14 hours of audio recordings where Joe and Mengqi Ji were arguing. Joe admitted he knew about the online relationship. He said he was worried about her safety, but also feared that she might not come back, even though he hoped she would, especially for the sake of their child. But it was that discovery of boots that was attached to Mengqi Ji's disappearance. The soles of the boots had juniper needles stuck in them, which were quite unique to a specific location. And this weird bit of botanical evidence ended up being key in solving the case, something pretty groundbreaking in forensic investigations. But how is it possible that just a tiny tree stick solved a bizarre case that almost took the detectives to a dead end? And what really happened to Mengqi Ji? Let's find out. 7 days later. October 15, 2019. 23-year-old Joseph Elledge walked into the Columbia, Missouri Police Department to report that his wife, 28-year-old Mengqi Ji, was missing. He showed up without a lawyer and reported that she had gone missing 6 days prior. According to Joseph, Mengqi Ji had been short-tempered and anxious on the night before her disappearance. He said that he tried to spend more time with her by giving her a massage, but she went to bed early, telling him that she had some appointments the following day. When Joseph asked who she was meeting, she answered vaguely and would not say any more. And exactly the following morning, she was gone. But local authorities, including prosecuting attorney Dan Knight, couldn't believe Joseph's story. So, to support his claim, Joseph said he had found some journal entries on Mengqi Ji's computer after she disappeared. These entries seemed to tell a different story, one about an emotional affair with a man in China. There, Mengqi Ji even mentioned she wasn't really interested in her marriage anymore. Joseph hinted that perhaps she had left for this fellow, and he reiterated this statement in a TV interview that perhaps maybe she just left on her own. A lot of the more personal, intimate text between Mengqi Ji and the guy from China was discovered afterwards. It revealed that it was so much more than a just emotional affair, since the messages reflected too many feelings of wanting. Plus, Mengqi Ji's background also complicated things a bit more. She was born in China, a one-child family, due to that country's one-child policy. Her parents were the most proud of her for being a top student at the prestigious university in China. She graduated with first-class honors and later obtained an undergraduate and a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering at the University of Missouri. She was no doubt a bright personality. Naturally, her parents were devastated by her disappearance and worked closely with the authorities. Assistant Prosecutor Yao Li, a Chinese immigrant, pointed out how much her family had invested in Mengqi Ji's success, and how hard it was for them to believe she would just vanish into thin air. But Elledge's account made it seem like she had simply left on her own. But there was no concrete evidence to back this up. And with the biggest question of where she went before she disappeared, everything still remained in the dark. Upon completion of college, a lecturer where she studied employed her with Nanova Biomaterials firm, in which position Mengqi Ji worked as the supervisor. That's where she first met Joe. And then, everything happened really quick, and before anyone would even realize it, on one hike in Rockbridge Memorial State Park, he asked Mengqi Ji for his hand. They tied the knot soon after. It was rumored that they rushed into it because Mengqi Ji's visa was about to expire, putting even more pressure on their relationship. At first, Mengqi Ji was the breadwinner since Joe had quit his job to focus on his studies. But when she got pregnant, She turned down a big job offer to stay home and be a full-time mom. She was all about her child when their baby was born in October 2018. Plus, she always stayed in touch with her family in China. But fast forward to October 9, 2019, Mengqi Ji's family started to get worried when they hadn't heard from her. They sent a friend to check in, and that's when Zhou finally reported her missing, oddly using the 311 non-emergency line instead of 911. The way Zhou told the story raised some eyebrows. He claimed he had spent the day driving around with their baby, looking for hiking trails, while also having Mengqi Ji's car, keys, and phone. This meant she had no way of getting in touch or getting back home, which seemed a little strange. The detectives started noticing something off about the way Zhou was acting. He wasn't exactly freaking out the way someone would if their spouse had gone missing. They began to wonder, how could Mengqi Ji have just disappeared on her own if she wasn't in any danger? But the problem is, she didn't inform anyone or seek assistance beforehand. Now here is what catches attention. There was no weapon, no blood, no one saw her leave, nor any indication that she's gone to China. Only one thing was pretty clear, that the marriage between Zhou and Mengqi Ji was one big mess. In that 14 hours of record of their argument, Zhou was telling Mengqi Ji that he hated being married to her, that he wanted out. He even threatened her, saying if she didn't play nice, he'd accuse her of being abusive in court and maybe even try to get her deported. But it got even darker when they listened to recordings from Mengqi Ji's phone. There were almost 4.5 hours of heated arguments, some of them really chilling. There was one recording from October 29, 2018, almost a year before she vanished. That was especially disturbing. In it, Zhou's voice was full of rage, and he was saying things like, "If you come back here, I've told you, it's not going to be pretty bad, and you want me to break? You want me to hurt somebody?" The whole thing gave the detectives a sick feeling that something really bad had been going on behind closed doors. The fact was, things really started to go downhill after their baby was born. Mengqi Ji's parents came all the way from China to help, like they traditionally do, staying for 100 days. But Zhou couldn't stand it. He hated that they spoke Chinese around him, feeling left out and excluded. He started getting really angry, even towards her mom, accusing that one of stirring up troubles and demanding she leave. The argument reached its peak one day when they were fighting over a cutting board while her mom was trying to make dumplings for his birthday. What he said seemed like a small problem, but he blew it up into something much bigger. As the tension built, Zhou started really tearing Mengqi Ji down. He'd call her incapable just because she was a woman, constantly putting her down. His words got darker, almost threatening, like when he said, "You know how I conquer nature? I kill it. I grab its head and break its neck." Both Mengqi Ji and her mom were completely taken aback by his anger, not even understanding where it was coming from. Overall, what came out painted a pretty disturbing picture. The home was full of manipulation, violence, and a lot of unresolved issues, all leading up to Mengqi Ji disappearing. There was also a taped meeting that really showed just how toxic things had gotten. Zhou didn't hold back his hatred for his mother-in-law, Ren. He said some pretty awful, violent things about her even when his own mom was there. It came out that he made Ren kneel and bow to him, forcing her to leave before the 100-day stay was up. Ren seemed to accept his apology and walked out, but it is obvious that by then Zhou had managed to exert a lot of control over her. Mengqi Ji's Arnolds, which Yao Li translated for the prosecutor's office, showed how confused she was and how hard it was for her to leave. Dan Knight, the prosecutor, thought Mengqi Ji might have felt trapped because her immigration status was hanging in the balance. She only had 5 months left before she could apply for her permanent green card. Then, just 2 weeks after Mengqi Ji went missing, the Columbia Police Department opened a criminal investigation. They showed up at Zhou's apartment with his mom in tow and demanded to know where Mengqi Ji was. Naturally, that day Zhou was arrested, but it wasn't for her disappearance, for something more sinister. The police suspected that he physically abused their daughter. The child had bruises, which Ren had first noted when she was telling Mengqi Ji to get over it. Zhou admitted that he caused the bruises when he tried to comfort a crying child. His lawyer also defended him as a young dad who probably made a mistake. but insisted that there is no evidence of ongoing abuse. However, Joe was held on a $500,000 bond, and his mom took custody of the daughter. Meanwhile, Dan Knight had a feeling that Mengqi Ji's case might eventually lead to a murder charge, though the evidence wasn't quite there yet. Investigators later connected some key findings, like the trees around the area where they were searching, to help solve the case. On October 25, 2019, the police carried out a search warrant at the apartment Joe and Mengqi Ji had shared. It was the same day Joe was arrested on suspicion of child abuse. When searching the apartment, investigators found some important evidence in Joe's backpack. Among other things, they discovered a script containing instructions for what Joe should say to the police. It even instructed him to speak of Mengqi Ji in the present tense, calling her a very dedicated person, a hard worker, and to point out all the things he claimed to like about her. That made them even more suspicious, because Joe had been saying his wife just walked away. So detectives went all in, searching every inch of the apartment. They didn't just stop at the obvious. They grabbed a muddy pair of Elledge's boots too, following a hunch that they might come in handy later. Even though nothing they found immediately screamed, "This is what happened to Mengqi Ji," they couldn't shake the feeling that Elledge's story wasn't adding up, so they kept digging. The investigation soon turned into a hunt for Mengqi Ji's body. The authorities began retracing Elledge's steps, focusing on his odd claim that he'd been taking leisurely drives with their baby in the back seat while his wife was missing. He said, "It was a nice day and I just wanted to go out," but that explanation didn't seem to sit right with anyone. But the problem was, no matter how much they searched, every lead led nowhere. Prosecutor Dan Knight then made a bold move: charge Elledge with first-degree murder, although he didn't have a body. He felt the evidence and the circumstances spoke for themselves. And just as things were heating up, something important came to light. Cell tower data showed that Elledge's phone had pinged near the Lammen River for half an hour the day Mengqi Ji vanished. He hadn't mentioned this to the police. But again, after months of searching, nothing turned up, and the search was called off by March 2020. Then, almost a year later, a hiker in a park where Elledge had proposed to Mengqi Ji noticed something strange. He saw a flash of color sticking out of the dirt. Using his walking stick, he poked around and found a purse, then shoes, and eventually a skull. It was Mengqi Ji's remains. It almost felt like a miracle. And so, the police had their final piece of the puzzle in order to proceed with charges against Elledge. Yao Li was on a video call with Mengqi Ji's parents, who were in China, when the news hit them like a ton of bricks. Mengqi Ji was dead. But what really got them was that no one could figure out exactly how she died. The medical examiner tried everything but couldn't pinpoint the cause. What they did know for sure was that Mengqi Ji's ribs had taken some serious damage. 4 of them were broken clean through, which was a sign of some kind of huge, brutal trauma. The examiner said that kind of injury would have caused a ton of pain, and it made them think that someone might have physically hurt her, giving off the vibe of possible abuse. Dan Knight again started piecing things together. He'd been collecting evidence for over a year and a half, and finally a big clue showed up. Joe's phone records placed him right near where Mengqi Ji's body was found on the day she went missing. It was a rainy day, but Knight was sure that there was something to back up his theory. Then he looked at Joe's boots and noticed they were covered in mud, soil, and gravel. These boots were shipped out for a forensic analysis and came back with something crazy. 12 kinds of plants stuck to the boot. Knight teamed up with Christine Edwards, a plant expert at the Missouri Botanical Garden, to dig deeper. They sent the boots off to a lab for further investigation. Edwards and her team extracted DNA from some juniper tree needles that were stuck on the boots. Edwards explained that plants have DNA just like humans do, so they hoped they could match the plants from the boots to the ones around Mengqi Ji's grave. To ensure they were getting the right match, Edwards' colleague Alex Linan went out collecting samples from juniper trees near the grave. They used a tall ladder and a long pole pruner to ensure that needles they were getting came from trees, not from the ground. After collecting the samples, they compared the DNA of the vegetation on Joe's boots from the tree needles sticking onto the boots with samples from other trees around Mengqi Ji's gravesite. Guess what? The results showed an exact match. Edwards and Linan were able to identify that the vegetation on the boots was that from the actual trees near Mengqi Ji's grave. So fast forward to November 1st, 2021, when Joe's trial for killing his wife, Mengqi Ji, kicked off. The case had an unusual twist. Unlike any other cases, tree DNA was actually used as evidence. After some back and forth in the courtroom, finally, Joe admitted he buried her in a shallow grave but denied he intended to kill her. According to the defense, Joe had argued with Mengqi Ji over her online affair with a guy in China. Later that night, on October 8, 2019, after Mengqi Ji had rejected him, they fought. As defense put it, during the tussle, Mengqi Ji attacked Joe, and in his own defense, he pushed her into a countertop. The defense expert, Dr. Keith Norton, said such a push could have fractured her ribs but would have required a lot of force. Joe claimed that Mengqi Ji attacked him, and when they both fell, she appeared almost knocked out, but then went to bed. The next morning, she didn't wake up. Joe shook her hard only to find that she was dead. Prosecutor Dan Knight told the court that Joe's account did not add up. Knight shot down the version of the defense, stating that murder was planned and had been building for months because of Joe's anger. He further hinted that Joe might have strangled her or suffocated her with a pillow, terming the crime brutal. Even though Joe stated that he loved Mengqi Ji, Knight argues that her death was of the deepest hate and frustration, leading to a violent explosion. Finally, after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with their decision. They found Joe guilty of second-degree murder. Basically, they believed he killed her but didn't plan it out ahead of time. Mengqi's parents seemed okay with the verdict, feeling like the justice system did its job. But then came the penalty phase. The jury had to decide how much time Joe would get. Dan Knight pushed hard for a life sentence while the defense asked for just 10 years. Mengqi's friends spoke out, sharing how much pain her death caused them. On the other side, Joe's mom, Jean Geringer, begged for mercy, saying it wasn't in her son's nature to do something like that. After a little over an hour of thinking it over, the jury sentenced Joe to 28 years in prison. Mengqi's family attorney said it was like a year for each of Mengqi's 28 years of life, a fitting symbolic sentence. And with that, back in December 2022, a custody agreement was finally settled for Mengqi's daughter. The plan was for the little girl to spend summers with Mengqi's parents in China, while the rest of the year would be with Joe's mom, Jean. Joe's lawyer, Scott Rosenblum, was pretty confident that Jean could handle raising the child, especially since she'd been trying to make sure Mengqi's parents stayed involved in the girl's life. But then, there's Dan Knight, who couldn't help but think about the trauma the little girl had already been through. She had been there when her mom was killed, and then to make things worse, she was driven around with her mom's body in the trunk. On top of all that, Joe had let the child believe her mom had just abandoned her. It's too much for a little girl to process. Mengqi's family and friends were determined to make sure the little girl knew the truth about her mom, that she was a loving, devoted mother who adored her. Even though Mengqi was gone, her legacy lived on in her daughter and in the memories of everyone who knew her. So what's your opinion about this case? How do you think Mengqi Ji exactly died? Was she going to leave Joe? Was Joe planning to kill her? Or it was just a hit-of-the-moment murder case? Share your views in the comments. And while this was a little unusual crime story, if you want to know something more bizarre, just click on this video to see how far and rituals can take one sane person and lead to horrifying and unthinkable things. Subscribe to this channel for more true crime content. See you soon.